I want to go back further in time and forward in time to look at some of the ways that we are digging deeper into our resources, and it's carrying forward into the work of our children's generation and even younger. I want to dedicate today's presentation to the memory of Molly Friedman. Molly passed away a week ago Thursday, and we celebrated her life at the beginning of last week. She and her husband, Bob, created the Bob and Molly Friedman Jewish Sound Archive at the University of Pennsylvania. And that resource was really a central resource, as we'll talk about a little bit later, to the development and understanding of Yiddish and Klezmer music by the current generation and our offspring. So what I want to look at is the ways that we connect to each other and what we find out when we do. Those of us who are involved in the work with Klezmer, and let me restate the definition of Klezmer for this purpose. Klezmer is the celebration music of East European Jewry, Ashkenazi particularly, that was once upon a time known as Yiddish music, or sometimes Freilich's music. It found its home in weddings and other celebrations. Klezmer was the name given to the musicians, and when it declined over the course of the 20th century from the combination of assimilation, emigration, annihilation, and the rise of Hebrew and Israeli music in Israel, it quieted down to the point that by 1980 or so, there was very little of it in public. The 1980s and 1990s saw a very strongly renewed interest in it, and that activity and the people who studied and performed it are often referred to as the Klezmer Revival, and those were the people specifically at the Mann Center in 1996. And they created the series of gatherings in which Klezmer music was studied, celebrated, and shared. Those included Klez Camp in the Catskills, the United States version of part of this, that began in 1985, followed by Klez Canada in 1997. And the Klez Camp, when it finished in 2014, many of the people involved in it created Yiddish New York, and that has been going since 2015. Also in Europe, Yiddish Summer Weimar is another center, and an important resource is the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. And so all of these have contributed to the understanding, study, and sharing of the Klezmer world. Some important research and resource sources for us as we dig deeper. So the theme today is, how are we digging deeper than what we learned when we gathered at all of these places? And they will touch on the Friedman Archive that I've mentioned. Library of Congress has interesting materials. A new project from the Klezmer Institute we'll look at, called the Kisagov-Magnetsky Digital Manuscript Project. And just out last month from the Cantorial Assembly is the Cantorial and Synagogue Music Archive. So I want to give you a flavor of what happens when you go to these places and study the resource materials. The Friedman Archive has a collection of more than 4,000 recordings. They used to be housed on Rittenhouse Square in the Dorchester in the Friedman's second apartment. It found its home at Penn, and it is a highly cataloged, pioneering catalog of this material. Bob Friedman, with a lot of Molly's help, created a database in the 1980s in which he had to create a Yiddish font in order to catalog it, and that remains an important resource. And a flavor of the kind of materials that you find there. Here's a Barry Sisters recording of Der Neue Scher, sometimes called the Wedding Samba, and this was had the flavor, not going back quite so far to the 1930s, when the crossover between Klezmer music or Yiddish music and popular music was very much the rage of the day. And so let's just listen to a little bit of the Barry Sisters.
Nimm dein Fiel, spiel du's neue Liedl, tanzen wird mit dem neuen Scher. In der Karre hat man dreht sich hin, du's Herz, der freut sich nur, wenn man tanzt dem neuen Scher.
Another resource is at the Library of Congress, where every every manuscript that is submitted for copyright is housed, and now many of them are accessible digitally. And you can search there for klezmer manuscripts. So here's one that I found that just was very intriguing to me because it was deposited by a Lowell Dubrow with the address of 420 South Street, Philadelphia, in 1920. Well, we spent 29 years living 3 blocks from 420 South Street, and we worship at Society Hill Synagogue 2 blocks away. And there is a tune that he copyrighted, although I think I've seen that tune in materials that came from Europe, and we're going to look at that other kind of resource. Another resource that became available to us beginning in 2018, really, is called the Kisselgoff-Makanetsky Digital Manuscript Project. This is a very exciting resource because it exposes manuscripts that were collected in ethnomusicological expeditions in 1910 to 1913. Baragovsky is one name that's associated with that, but one of the people that did the field work was named Kisselgoff, and those manuscripts have been in a library in Kiev ever since, but weren't seen anywhere outside of that until 2018, when a group of scholars meeting in Tokyo with a Japanese scholar talked about it and were able to convince the Ukrainian library folks to make this material accessible. There has formed a group studying this material. This project is transcribing these tunes that we're seeing in manuscript, transcribing and translating the materials around them. So I want to give you just a little flavor of what it's like to work with this manuscript. We have 1,400 pages of material, and many of these are tunes that we know, many of them are tunes that we don't know. And it's just fascinating to time travel into this material. One of the benefits of the pandemic is that groups of us working on it together will take a sheet of this, put it on the screen, and read it together carefully to make sure that we're understanding it. This is actually a pretty accessible piece. It's a dirhu from the Pesach Seder, except that it is presented in transliteration because it's very hard to write music with Hebrew letters or Yiddish letters on it. But the transliteration follows the pattern of the European transliterations, and it's also in dialect. So it comes out adir hi, ivne beso, bekorov, bimheira, and so forth. The actual tune is a klezmer tune, which is just fun. So it goes something like yet da 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 da. I can't sing it well enough. I play it better on clarinet, but that's how it goes. The Kisselgoff project has just released an enormous amount of fresh, old material. And the artists today are going back to that to find fresh inspiration and new old stuff. So here's an example of contemporary artists. In fact, the clarinetist Kurt Bjorling was one of the people who was on stage with Brave Old World at the Mann Center, and he and his wife are playing a little of one of these tunes that they learned from those manuscripts. The Cantorial and Synagogue Music Archive, a project of the Cantors Assembly, was released to the public last month. This takes materials that have been assembled from a variety of collections and makes them available online. Cantorial music is an important source for klezmer. It's the sound that the people who played the instrumental and celebration music had in their heads. In the world in which they grew up. And it echoes through much of our playing. So to have access to this cantorial material informs us as instrumental musicians. The great cantorial work of the 20th century, traveling from Europe and really finding a home in the United States, had its height in the early years of the 20th century into the middle years of the 20th century. There's an interesting technological parallel that I'd like to draw, which is that in the early years of the 20th century, the recordings, vinyl records, became widely available and were produced by the hundreds of thousands in Europe, and continued here. That material got buried in basements, and that's part of what the Friedman Archive is about. But that sharing enabled this music to be much more widely shared than it was before the recording technology came along. And so the parallel is today, the internet technology is allowing us to share this music much more widely again. Here's Jack Mendelson, a terrific cantor, retired from Temple Israel in White Plains, sharing a little bit of this kind of traditional cantorial work. Another way that we have worked with our inheritance of this music is through the people that I call living treasures, folks who had their upbringing in the worlds in which Yiddish music came from and who continued to perform it well into our lifetime. All of those folks have passed away, some of them quite recently. All of them actually were at one or another of Klez Camp or Klez Canada and Yiddish Summer Weimar. And so we've been able to share their work and train the younger generations through it. I want to give you a flavor of some of what they brought to us. Bela Schechter Gottesman, who lived in the Bronx for most of her life, but I believe was born in Europe. Her husband was the editor of the Yiddish Forward. Her son, Itzhak Gottesman, was also the editor of the Yiddish Forward. She was a poet and wrote new music to the end of her life just a few years ago. So here's a little bit of her singing.
Schlaf man, kind man, Kaddish eine, Haida, lululu. Schlaf man, kind man, Kaddish eine, Haida, lululu. In Amerika der Tate, deiner Sinne, bist da Kind nach schlafles Hatte.
Bela's Yiddish is just marvelous. And Yiddish, after all, means Jewish. And Yiddish music is Jewish music. So fundamentally, listening to Bela singing in Yiddish attaches us to the tradition fully. Another person who came to us from Europe as an adult, really quite late in life, is German Goldenstein. He was born in Bessarabia, now Moldova, a place which is really the crossroads of Jewish music. It's where the Ottoman music met the East European music, met the Romanian music, met the Roma, or sometimes known as Gypsy music, and was a very fertile place. For German to come to the United States in the 1990s, or perhaps the late 80s, gave us someone who really grew up in that tradition. Bessarabia became part of the Soviet Union in 1939, so that they had a continuing Yiddish Jewish presence that was a continuing chain from the earlier experience, much of which was cut off in the Soviet Union, and of course, much of which was destroyed in the Holocaust. But he came to us and we got to play with him. Another person who came to us from a long European experience is Arkady Gendler. He was also born in the area of Romania or Salokia, Bessarabia. So another person from Bessarabia. He wrote songs. He became known to the revival community in the 1990s and had opportunities to perform and study at many of the places that we've mentioned. In this case, he's at the Krakow Jewish Culture Festival in 2007, I think it is. And it was backed by a band that included the other trombone player that we've referred to in the family, Daniel Blacksberg. His, again, coming from a Yiddish music source that was continued well until recent times from traditional roots.
Die erste Lied, was ich will singen, heißt Sei freilich.
The first song that I'd like to sing you is called Sei freilich, Be Happy.
Dus ist der Iker nicht nur von jüdischen Lied, nur von ganzen jüdischen Leben.
Here the idea is not only about Jewish song, it has to do with all of Jewish life.
Weil dort die Oibwärter sind, soll viele das Herz zerrissen sein, nur freilich sollst du sein.
Because here the main point is, no matter how many pieces your heart may be torn into, the idea is to still celebrate and be happy.
Land von Frieden und ein Land von Treue. Wenn ihr der Mann sich in deine Lang ist, nur ich wein und ich bedeue.
One of the most important figures in our Jewish music experience is Theodor Bickel. I mentioned at the outset, or Mariah did on my behalf, that Theodor Bickel's records played in our house all the weeks of the year. In the 50s and 60s, that Jewish music was perhaps one of the most widely distributed at a time when there was very little. He has been an activist, and in this case, he's at the Krakow Jewish Festival in 2007. And I'm going to play a little bit more of this because it's so moving. He sang Zognit Kenmo, the partisan elite, and standing literally within feet of where the folks whose lives were lost lived.
The stillness. This is the stillness of the voices that were taken away from us. People who lived here and there and 2 streets away, Motri-Gebirtig. Voices that were taken from us. We are the voices that are left. We must be their voice, carrying their song. And so we will do the hymn of the survivors, of those who fought and those who survived. Never say that you've walked the final way, though leaden skies obscure the light of day. The hour we longed for will certainly appear, and our steps will proclaim we are still here. Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg. Gott Himmeln bleibe, verstellen neue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte schon. Es wird abbeugt an unser Trott, wir seien da. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte schon. Es wird abbeugt an unser Trott, wir seien da. Vom grünen Palmenland bis weißen Land von Schnee. Wir kommen heut mit unser Pein, mit unser Weh. Und jeder spritzt, was ist gefallen, unser Blut. Sprotzen wird dort unser Gwure, unser Mut. Von jedem spritzt, was ist gefallen von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird dort unser Gwure, unser Mut.
Another resource that has become available and renewed for us is the study of the Yiddish language. And there's 2 that I'll mention. One is Duolingo. which gives you an opportunity to use gamesmanship to learn Yiddish. I've been doing that for about a year. And another is a publication of the Jewish Book Center called In Einem. The folks who worked on it, Asya Weissman-Schulman, Jordan Brown, Michiel Yashinsky, are among the young leaders of the study of Yiddish. And this is a remarkable work that adds enormous depth to the Yiddish study that for years has had some rather aging texts. So a lot of active study going on. There's several 100,000 people using Duolingo for Yiddish. I think thousands of people studying from In Einem. So how is this carrying forward to the work of today? And how are we seeing new work and refreshed work coming from that which we've learned from all of these sources? An important milestone is the Yiddish production of Fiddler on the Roof. This is the work of the Folksbiene Theater in New York, led by artistic director Zalman Mlotek, who has a very deep history in all of this, and the Folksbiene Theater has a continuing history. But this production, opening in 2018, brought a fresh perspective to material that we've had for more than 50 years. And I just want to share a little bit of that. The Yiddish gives it a depth and a connection to Jewish life that grows enormously from what was in the English text. Here, Stephen Skybell, who played Tevye, and Jennifer Bobiak, who played Golda, sing Do You Love Me? Skybell did not study Yiddish just a little bit before he took on the role, and he mastered it. Jennifer Bobiak's not Jewish, but she, like the rest of the cast, studied Yiddish deeply to perform in it, and they were just wonderful.
Is a guter Bocher, Golde. Gefällt mir. Is a bissel zerdreiter. Aber angesagt mit Joische von oben bis herab. Gefällt mir, wie Alkohol am Hodel. Wie steht dort geschrieben? Oh, Harvey, will sie will ihm. Tot was kann man tun? Es ist eine neue Welt. Eine neue Welt. Liebe. Golde. Liebst mich, Herze?
Zie ich was?
Liebst mich, Herze?
Do You Love Me is in Schrager Friedman's Yiddish, written in 1966, is Liebst mich Herze, but that actually means, do you love me with your heart? And I love it. I just love it. Another, and close to home, example of the way that traditional material is being refreshed, represented, and just exciting. The project's called The Honorable Mention. The pun is deliberate. Michael Winograd, clarinetist, leads the group. He's assembled a group of musicians who span the generation of the revival and their children. They are all virtuosic musicians. Let's take a look at just a little listen to them. We'll get to hear them, a little bit more of them later. Another group that represents an even younger and fresher perspective of drawing on tradition and rephrasing it as their own is a group called Sibylla. The word means onions. And they reimagined the wedding song Lo mir sich überbitten, let's forget, as Mir wollen sei überleben, we will outlive them. An exciting young group and committed to their Yiddish heritage and expressing it afresh. In this next section, I want to take the concept of the older material and its regeneration in the work of the new folks and comparing some of that source material to the way similar or sometimes the same materials being presented today. The first pairing is the cantor Moshe Oisher and the Canadian performer Josh Dolgan, who performs as so-called, often in rap. And actually, that connection seems fitting somehow because Moshe Oisher was known for scat. And he was really good at it, had a radio show in the 30s. It turns out he lived about 5 blocks from where our family lived when in the first few years of my life. Life just has all these coincidences. So many decades later, Josh Dolgan on the roof in Canada.
Ai, die Rumänische Kretschmer, Fisto Hockenedel, a Wiener Weibermädel. Ai, die Rumänische Kretschmer, ai, die Rumänische Kretschmer.
Another pairing. Dave Taras was one of the most famous klezmer clarinetists. He came from Europe in the early 20s, survived until nearly 1990, and so he was able to connect to the folks who were responsible for the klezmer revival. But just to give a flavor of it, here we were going to connect Taras to Winograd, and here's a little bit of Doina played by each of them.
I brought my wife here and I have to make a living. One of the musicians.
And in one of the largest audiences ever for Doina, this shepherd's tune done as a clarinet virtuoso period, Michael Winograd with a group called Wolfpack, a full Madison Square Garden. Another pairing. Molly Pecan, star of the Yiddish film world, performed until past 1980. She was on Broadway. She was in Milk and Honey. She was actually on an episode of Car 54, Where Are You?, which is really quite amusing. And here is a little of her singing from the film Mamala.
A bissel Sinn, a bissel Regen, a ruhig auf dem Kopf zu legen, a wir sind, können glücklich sein. A Schiech, a Sock, a Kleid und Lattes, ein Kästchen, a drei, vier Slottes, a wir sind, können glücklich sein. Die Luft ist frei vor jeden Gleier, die Sinn, sie scheint vor jeden eine Murmelrei. Bist du frei, dann bist du wach, mit Freund, da schnappst du machen, wir sind, können glücklich sein.
Molly Pecan was actually born in the United States and had to learn Yiddish to be able to be in those films. Miriam Chaya Siegel, contemporary of our young folks, well, here's a little of Miriam Chaya.
Hebt schon auf dem Becher, hebt es Friede ruhig. Siehst doch ein Tassimche, to freut sich jeden euch. Gießt schon un mit Bronzen, gießt schon un mit Wein. Wir werden Tage holen, wir werden schicker sein. Hey, ai di di dai, da 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 dai, da da dai dai, da da dai dai dai. Ai di di dai, da da da. Sing with me. Ai da 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 dai dai.
Her resemblance to the young Molly Pecan is part of the delight. We listened to a bit of Bela Schechter Gottesman earlier, and I'm not going to replay that example, but I want to show you how one of our young performers really draws on that heritage. This is a group called Berikis, and they're based at the Yiddish Book Center in Massachusetts. The singer is Ada Hetko, and she's been on staff at Klezmer Canada, and this is just pretty.
In Tropensteuze fällt der Heumer von Gras und Blum, von Gras und Blum. Und wer es will, kann sehen, das edelige Spiel von Schwarz und Feier, von Blau und Silber. Darum auftritt, zerlegte schlafen bei mir. Darum auftritt, schlafen bei mir. Darum auftritt, zerlegte schlafen bei mir. Darum auftritt, schlafen bei mir. Die Schatten wachsen in der Hecht, die Luft ist kiel, kiel und weich. Wie Trug in Wasser, die Schatten wachsen in der Hecht, die Luft ist kiel, kiel und weich. Wie Trug in Wasser.
Another pairing. Naftali Brandwein was the other great klezmer clarinetist. Our grandmother, Rochel Brandwein, was a cousin of his, coming from the same shtetl, and he's also inspired Daniel and friends. So here's a little of what Brandwein sounded like. A little bit more of the honorable mention will give us a flavor of what that kind of playing has turned into. I hope you've heard a little bit about the transformation of historical materials that we're getting afresh from old sources informing the work of our younger performers. I mentioned that the pandemic has brought together people from around the world. One of the ways that we did that was to support the folks in Ukraine. And a consortium of Jewish music organizations worldwide presented 12 hours of performances in early May from the west coast of the United States all the way around the globe back to Australia in 11-minute sequences. And it was my pleasure to help make that work on the back end. It is really exciting to be able to connect that way. A phenomenon that's another way that we're making the Jewish experience of the early 20th century part of our own lives is the Yiddish dance party. Dan has led a number of these, and it turns out Yiddish dancing is much richer in its way than the horisets that a lot of people do at their weddings. And here's a couple of ways of looking at that. This is from something called the Golden Fest Festival in Brooklyn, and it just gives a flavor of what that kind of dancing can be like. To end this presentation, I come back home, and it is all in the family, and I have the privilege of being able to play at times with my sons, Dan on trombone and Aaron on accordion. Aaron suggested that the three of us play at Aaron's wedding, and it is an honor, a privilege, and a deep connection to where we've come from, and I hope where we're going in the world of Yiddish and Jewish music and klezmer.
Thank you again, Bob, and I hope to see you in other programs of Golden Slipper, for summer programs and later on, whenever, music or other topics. Thank you again, and bye-bye.